Hey guys, thanks for coming out. I'm Adrian, one of the developers of Django, which is a Python web framework. Nice to see that a lot of you guys were Python developers. First, I'm just going to show you a little bit about the background of Django, where it came from. It was derived out of a real-world application. So, it's in order to understand Django, it's kind of important to understand the culture that it kind of came out of. You know, it sounds really exciting, but basically, I'm Adrian. I live here in Chicago. Grew up in the suburbs. I work for WashingtonPost.com as editor of editorial innovations, which is a fancy title essentially for mad scientists that get to do cool stuff for the website, like basically build database-driven applications on deadline. But I've only been doing that for 3 months. Before that, I was actually living in Kansas, which is not quite as bad as you might think. No, it's actually a lot better than that, because I lived in a town called Lawrence, Kansas. Really, really cool college town, cool architecture. Got some Lawrence people in here. Got a great music scene. There's a lot of cool bars and restaurants and stuff. Very, very cool place. But that's not the reason I moved there. I moved there because the newspaper was really, really good. I have a journalism background, and my background is kind of between journalism and computer programming. I developed news web applications. So this web operation in Lawrence, Kansas, believe it or not, is really, really cool, really, really cutting edge. They do a lot of really, really cool stuff. So I went to work there. And I'll give you an example of one of the cool things that we did. I told you about the music scene in Lawrence. We said, okay, wouldn't it be cool if there were a site that you could go to that represented Lawrence, all the music scene, had all the stuff, all the events happening, all the bars and restaurants, all that stuff. So we made this, Lawrence.com. Lawrence.com is easily the most in-depth local entertainment site in the world. This thing just freaking kicks ass. Starting out with the basics, it has an events calendar, which is, you know, every entertainment site has one. It has the standard stuff, when, where it's happening, what the cost is. But when it gets really interesting is the band database, where, I don't know if you guys know allmusic.com, but it's essentially allmusic.com at a local level. Plus it ties into the events database so that on this bands page it says upcoming shows at the Granada this Friday, at the Bourgeois Pig on Tuesday, and it pulls in all the genres, all the biographical information about the band. And everything's in a huge database so that when you go to the page for this band, you can see, oh, those are the musicians in the band. Click on one of those musicians, you see all the other bands he's in. See, okay, this guy plays pedal steel. So you click on pedal steel, you see all the other people in town who play pedal steel. It's just kind of this huge database of all local entertainment stuff. And because it's very music oriented, every band has song clips in the system. We have entire MP3s, around 1,000 MP3s of all local music. It's just very, very intense. And the way this stuff integrates is very, very cool. On the events page, if you're looking at an event that happens to be associated with a local band in the band database, it'll pull in those links and say related band pages, boom, boom, boom. It'll look at those bands and it'll say, okay, do any of these bands have songs in the songs database? Yes, okay, in this case there were. So it says if you go to this event, you might hear these songs, blah, 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 blah. So we're doing some really cool things. They're including a radio station that's this little flash whizzy interface that automatically grabs all the song clips for a particular band. There's genre stations. You can make your own stations, which are called playlists. Very, 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 very interactive site. You can create your playlist. You can comment on other people's playlists. You can comment on essentially any object in the system. There's an album discography database. You can comment on any band, any event, any story. There's blogs. There's an intense restaurant database with not only the basics, like which cuisine it is in which region, but whether it's a homie's favorite. The site authors refer to themselves as the homies, whether it's vegetarian friendly, and whether it accepts barter. No restaurant in Lawrence accepts barter, but we've been thinking of adding a little thing that says, if you actually search for that, it says, like, are you stupid or something. But the point is, it does a lot of cool stuff. Because we fielded all the restaurant closing and opening times, we're able to say, here are all the restaurants that are open right now. So at 4 p.m. or whatever time it is right now, it's not very impressive, but if you're drunk at 1 a.m. and you want to get some grub, go to this page and there's all this stuff that's still open. Speaking of being drunk, there's a drink specials database. This is lined up, which is updated every day and has all the drink specials for every bar in town every day. People actually print this thing out and put it next to their beds. I'm not making this up. Simon's really nice to this.
Wasn't me.
And you can export drink specials to your iPad, so if you're walking around town, you can get out your iPad and there's your drink specials. There's the drink specials integrated in the events calendar. Like I'm saying, yeah?
Have you integrated the drink thing with your GPS so that drunk people can find their way from our bar?
That's a good
In the
idea.
works.
I hope you're getting the impression that everything kind of knows about everything else. It's one gigantic database. This example, on an events page for an event, if the event happens at a bar and the bar has a drink special for the day that the event is happening, it'll pull in drink special. If you go to this event, here's the drink special for that place. Now, living in Chicago, I really wish that Metromix did something like this. Metromix, bad. Essentially, there's tons of cool data on this site. Go through a couple more things. The downloads page, we wanted to have kind of a front door for all the stuff you can download on this site. But of course we can put like random MP3s. Here's a bunch of random MP3s. But that wouldn't be that exciting. So we were thinking what would be a cool, timely way of displaying MP3s as they're added to the site. This page, what it does is it looks at the events calendar. It finds all the bands that are playing according to the events calendar in the local band database, and of those, which ones have MP3s. So every time you go to this page, it's fresh, it's new, it's got new stuff according to who's playing. So if everyone has, get the MP3, get band information. Oh, by the way, they're playing live Friday at the bottom of it. There's a mobile edition, so that if you're stumbling around drunk in downtown Lawrence, you can pull up the drink specials to further your alcoholism. You can see which restaurants are open right now, and you can get a bunch of other stuff that kind of makes sense to have in a cell phone context. There's blogs, there's podcasts, there's, like I said, comments on everything. There's other stuff that I didn't want to offend anyone with. And essentially, why am I bringing this up? The point is you kind of have to understand the intensity of all the cool shit we did in Lawrence. And that was kind of our unofficial motto. We build cool shit. We wanted to do cool stuff. We wanted to put it on really rapidly, improve these sites. We'd get these ideas like on the events calendar, you can sign up to get reminded of an event. And that just happened one day when somebody told me, hey, did you know that you can send SMS via email? Oh, I didn't know that. Let's add it to the site. Okay, let's do it today. My boss calls me on a Saturday night. Hey, here's this cool idea for the site. Why don't we do it? And I'm like, hey, I'm at the computer anyway. I'll just do it right now. So that's the kind of culture. Where does this come from? It's this guy, Rob Curley. He was our boss there. And he really encouraged this really, really rapid web development. It's essentially web development, computer programming with journalism deadlines. It's a fusion of those two concepts. The first thing that he was really, really pushing on us is that we need to develop things very, very quickly. An example of that is toward the end of last year, around the elections. He said, hey, oh my God, I just realized there's a presidential debate tonight. Wouldn't it be cool if users could sign on to our news site and rate the candidates? I hear these wacky ideas. Wouldn't it be cool if people could rate candidates on like whether they made sense, how eloquent they were, whether they made any weird facial expressions? And by the way, if you could do it in 4 hours, please. So this kind of culture, first of all, drove us insane. Secondly, it really encouraged us to come up with some sort of solution that would let us make websites, first of all, that are very intense and cool and interactive and all that, but also that we can do it quickly. The second thing, we did end up making that presidential debate scorecard in 4 hours. So it was Jacob who's doing AV stuff today. The second thing that he was always pressing on us was the ink is never dry on these babies. Newspaper term, of course, ink being a newspaper thing, but the concept is you create a web application of some sort. Of course, you have to create it quickly. That's the first point I had, but once you create it, the thing's not done yet. Inevitably, requirements change. You're going to have to change that thing to add more features, more ways of browsing, more ways of searching, all that stuff. The restaurants thing that I showed you, for example, when that first started, it was just type of food and location of town. All those other things, including barter. Barter, I just added one night when I was futzing around. But all those other things were ideas that our editors had that said, oh, wouldn't it be cool if on the restaurant search you could have search by whether they accept Visa or American Express. So boom, the ink is never dry on these things. You got to be able not only to make them the first version very quickly, but you have to be able to update them very, very fast. So we originally used PHP for this. The original version of Lawrence.com was a PHP app, which started out okay, but it got quite messy. The problems with PHP were the syntax was very verbose. You had to edit a lot of files to get stuff done. I know it is in theory possible to do good PHP, but it's just so much of a hassle. The language doesn't encourage good practice. Introspection abilities were very bad. You couldn't really follow the don't repeat yourself principle because you had to put this in this file and this in this file. And it was hard to maintain. And this all ended up being kind of, and then there's the namespace thing. This is, of course, for those of you who didn't get the joke, a list of the first 30 PHP functions that start with A, available in any PHP script. And I believe, what's the latest on PHP namespaces? They thought about it.
It's going into 6, probably.
I believe it when I see it. So that just became a very hairy thing. So Simon and I, around this point, it was about 2 years ago when we were getting a little tired of PHP, we discovered Python. And we just immediately fell in love. Essentially, we loved the terse syntax. We loved how you could introspect it. We loved the dynamic abilities. It's so clean and it encouraged best practices. We just said, okay, we have to do this. We have to move all web development to Python because we're going to go freaking insane if we stay with this PHP. So we decided to make this framework for our internal needs. I showed you this, the entertainment site we have. We have a news site, sports site, and the organization does development for outside companies. So kind of a lot of different types of stuff that we do. So this framework that we were putting together, it had a couple of goals. One, like I hope I've been pounding in your brain, we really had the need to make web development stupidly fast. Like 4 hours, not 6 months fast. Like 2 days for an intense classified system. Jacob, just this past week, wrote an entire classified system between 9 p.m. and 3 a.m. No doubt powered by a lot of coffee or something. We wanted to automate the repetitive stuff. There are certain tasks in web development that are just so freaking boring, like validation routines and making sure that input is clean and all this stuff. We just wanted the framework to take care of that for us. We wanted to practice loose coupling so that if we didn't like a certain part of the system, we could swap in another, say, template language. We could swap in, say, another database abstraction layer. We wanted to follow best practices. Simon and I, who developed this originally, are obsessive perfectionists. We really, really strongly believe in the foundation principles of HTTP, that everything that affects data on the server should use POST, use GET properly, use beautiful URLs, because doing ugly URLs is just pathetic. We want to be efficient. We didn't want this to be some sort of really high-level framework that did a lot of cool stuff, but didn't care about the efficiency. It needed to be fast. We're powering more than 1 million page views a day. So if it doesn't need to do a database query, don't do a freaking database query. Be efficient. The end goal was we wanted to create Lawrence.com with this framework. When we created the framework, we kind of had a trial by fire because we had a bunch of websites that we were making as we were creating the framework, so we kind of had to take a break, then go back to the framework, take another break, go back to the framework. Essentially, the end goal, though, was to make Lawrence.com. So one of these trials by fire was when Rob came up to us and he said, hey, it's summer, that means it's time for Little League. And he had this wacky idea. Why don't we take local Little League, which is about 100, more than 200 teams or something like that, and treat these guys like they're the New York Yankees. So I'm thinking every team gets its own page with a list of who they're playing, what field they're at, game info. Game info ties into our local weather database so that if a game's in the next 5 days, which is the time range for which we have weather forecasts, it'll pull in that weather forecast and display it right on there. Why don't we give every league of Little League its own page with what teams are in it, what the standings are, so these guys can do it. We didn't want to do player detail pages because of privacy reasons, but if these guys were 18, we would have been doing that. We wanted to have a database of every field that these guys play on, because there are incredibly subtle differences between 4H East and 4H Middle, but you can go on this site and click on and do a little 360-degree view thing if you care. And of course, we wanted to make it so that parents could sign up for cell phone alerts so that if games were canceled, the website would email them. And of course, do this in 3 days. So we did, using Django. This was the first really big thing that we did, and it worked. And we were like, wow, this is really, really cool. We should use this. And we did. We continued to build it, and we ended up converting Lawrence.com to use it. Lawrence.com is now powered by that. Our news site, ljworld.com, is powered by that. All of our internal sites that our company had, and also all our commercial development that we did for other companies. So let's fast forward a couple years to PyCon. If you guys don't know, this is the Python conference that's every year. This year is in DC. Simon and I, and also our other developer, Jacob Kaplan-Moss, who's handling AV, went there. And we did a short lightning talk, just 5 minutes, showing off Django and what it does and how fast it makes things. And people were just going gaga over this thing. We got a lot of people came up to us afterward. I got a lot of emails afterwards, so we were thinking, wow, we should open source this, not only because it would be a cool service to contribute back to the community, but because it would get outside developers giving us code. So, it's kind of a win-win. So we did. We open sourced it in July. This is the Django website. It's at djangoproject.com. I'll have that URL later also. And in July, since July, we've had a ton of awesome contributions. People have been using it. It's just kind of blown my mind. People all over the world, Poland, Australia, using it. It's awesome. So what does this actually do? I've kind of given a lot of background, but haven't actually talked code. There's the stack. Number one is the database wrapper. Now what this does is it converts Python code into SQL so that you don't have to write SQL statements. I'm going to alternate my usage of SQL and SQL to please both camps. See if I can keep it straight. The second level is the URL dispatcher, which, because we're obsessed with clean URLs and because we mix and match different applications on different sites, for example, on Lawrence.com we had a forum system, on our news site we had a forum system, but they had different URLs in different places. So the URL logic had to be abstracted into this URL dispatcher thing. There's a template system which separates content from presentation. I think that's pretty much a well-known concept. And there's the admin framework, which is kind of Django's crown jewel, which I'll go over in a minute. That essentially automates all the boring-ass stuff that's involved with validation and creating sites that are purely for editing stuff. Finally, there's a lot of niceties galore, such as RSS framework and all these other things that I'll go into. When you do a Django app, the first, assuming it's database driven because it's not necessarily, doesn't necessarily have to use a database, the first thing you do is you design your database schema. Now, if we're going to do, just for a sample application for the purposes of this, we'll do a little blog. It won't be written by a cat, but pretend it is. When you're creating generally a database-driven app, the first thing you do is you create table statements, right? Create table blog entries that has an ID, headline, varchar, entry, and then the pub date. Well, in Django, how you would represent that is instead of in SQL, you would represent that as a Python class. It looks very similar. Just be a class the headline is just an attribute of that class. The body is another attribute, and the pub data is another attribute. So that's it. All you need to do is write those 4 lines, and you get a whole heck of a lot of stuff for free. The first thing is it generates the create table statement for you. Obviously, if it didn't do that, it would really suck. The second thing is it gives you a Python API to actually edit this information. So you don't have to write SQL statements. Here's how you would instantiate an entry object. Pass in the headline, the body, the pub date, and you do e.save, and that saves it. Pretty straightforward. I'm not writing any SQL. I can change attributes on it and save again, and it'll do the update statement instead of an insert. You can get stuff out of the database using this getList API. You can pass parameters to getList that specify essentially your where clause, what you want to narrow, how you want to narrow down the search, such as just show me the entries with a certain pub date, just show me the ones that are published equals true or something like that. You can get a particular entry out of the database like this. Here I'm passing in pk equals 3. The primary key is 3. That would get me that entry. And you just use attribute syntax to access the column values. So that would display the headline. Note to the purists, this does allow you to still drop in the raw SQL if you want to. I hope you've gotten the impression that Simon and I, when we were designing this, didn't intend. We're big perfectionists, and we know that you have to drop into SQL if you need to. We don't want the framework to be something that gets in your way. We want it to be something that makes things super quick. So it's very, very easy to drop into SQL, and essentially in any part of the stack, you can drop down a level if need be. So a lot of web development revolves around these admin forms, right? This is a piece of crap. This is the piece of crap that I used to update my blog that I wrote in PHP like 5 years ago, literally. And you know, everyone who's a web developer has done these things. It's kind of like if you're a web developer, you've made these. This is a tremendous pain in the butt because you have to, first of all, display that form. You have to redisplay it with validation errors if there are any validation errors. You have to write the validation logic. And finally, you have to do the logic that actually saves things. And that's just for adding. There's changing, there's deleting too. Fortunately, with Django, this is a solved problem because we've abstracted it to the level where it will generate those forms automatically for you in a production-ready thing that we call the admin site. To do that, here's that entry class that I was showing you that represents a blog entry. If you want to give it admin capability, all you have to do is add that. The class meta is an inner class that holds metadata about that. Admin is just one of the many things that you can put in there that is just kind of a holding place for metadata. So just put in that admin equals meta admin, and it will give you, boom, an admin site. This is the admin site for the Lawrence operation, which has a ton of stuff. Essentially, when you add that admin, this looks and finds all the objects in your system that have admin turned on. And it displays links to them, and it keeps track of your recent actions on the side, and it does authentication and all that stuff. Here's, for example, an add screen where for a photo object, it knows based on the database type, based on the field definition, what type of widget to use. So for example, that first one, there's photo. That, when it was in the model, when it was described in Python, was a file field. It knows that file field in database is a text field. And in the admin, it's a little widget that is a file selector. For the second one there, it's a text field in a database, and it knows that it's a big-ass text area. For the third thing, that's a many-to-many relationship. So for those, it pulls in multiple select box. And down there, staff member is a many-to-one, so it puts in a little drop-down. And at the bottom, creation date, which I hope you can see, is a date-time field. And for any date-time field, it automatically puts in the little date widgets, and you can click on the little today shortcut, and there's a little calendar icon, and it pulls in a JavaScript calendar, and it's very exciting. So the point is, this is production ready. This is something that it just works. You don't have to hack with it, and you definitely don't have to code all this logic. The really messy thing that I mentioned about admin sites as the validation. Well, it automatically takes care of that for you. Here's, if I had submitted it empty, this is what I would have gotten. It knows which fields are required because you specify that in your model. You keep every piece of domain logic in your model. That's the one true place that all metadata about your objects live. One of those things is whether a field is required. One of those things is implicit in the type of the field. For instance, date fields must be in a certain format, so the admin will validate that for you automatically. And of course, you can add custom validators to your heart's content. The point with this is that it's completely production ready. The way we worked in Lawrence was we would talk to the client. Here's a client that we had, the Lawrence Chamber of Commerce. They wanted us to make a website for them. So we would talk to them, and they said, okay, well, let's put an accommodations thing. Let's have a thing of all the local hotels and the shopping malls and all that stuff so that people will come visit Lawrence. So given that, we just coded up those models in like half an hour, and we were able to give them an admin site, which number one, blew their minds, and number two, let them put stuff in there automatically, or let them put stuff in there right away so that they can start putting content in so that we can focus on doing the interesting things. Here's another site. We did a site for the Attorneys Association of Kansas. And this blue jean clad website in Denver that was a local radio station. These are all examples of clients that we gave them the admin interface right away. They started putting data in, and we were able to work on it production ready. So let us focus on the interesting stuff. We haven't really written any much code thus far. We've just written that little 4 lines of the model that describes the data. The next thing you do when you write a Django app is you design the URLs. We don't want this kind of stuff. We don't want to put .php, we don't want .cgi, and annoying query strings with question marks and scary characters. We don't want to expose the underlying framework in the URLs, because that's evil. We don't, and we especially don't want to do this, which I believe is vignette and is disgusting. It's really ugly. Very, very ugly. So how it works in the Django framework is you specify it in pure Python code. This is what's called as a URL configuration, where you just, it's essentially a mapping between URLs and the callbacks. So in this example, for anyone who goes to blog, it'll call the Python function myapp.blog.homepage. If anyone goes to /blog archive, it'll call myapp.blog archive. And in the last example, it displays the capability of capturing things from the URL. So if you go to blog archive and then any number, that's just simple regular expression syntax. It will pass that as a parameter to the function myapp.blog.permalink. Let's take one of these for example. Let's do some actual work. In this example, which was the last one on that screen, blog archive, and then any number, that will call the function permalink. So let's write that function. Boom, there it is. It takes entry ID, which is whatever was captured in the URL, and it returns an HTTP response. This is a view function. Views get, as their first argument, a request object, which has all sorts of metadata about the request, like what browser it was, get and post data, what the URL was, and all that. And entry ID was taken from the URL. A view is essentially responsible for returning an HTTP response object, which can be anything you want. It can be HTML, plain text, it can be a PDF, it can be CSV, you can generate images, anything you want. But this is really, really lame and boring, so let's beef it up a little bit. This is what the code would look like if you actually wanted to implement this. The first line there is get object or 404. You pass it your model module, and you tell it which parameters to use. So use the entries and get the object that has pk equals whatever the entry ID that was passed in the URL. You save that in the variable e, and then you render to a response object using the blog permalink template, passing it entry as the template context. I'll get into the template context in a little bit. Very little code, but it does a lot. I'll also mention, for those of you that are in PHP or anything in those scary worlds, you don't have to worry about quoting database. You don't have to worry about SQL injections, because entry ID is quoted for you by the backend database. So it makes things, it just takes care of things for you. What does the template look like? I'll go back one. We loaded the blog permalink template and passed it one variable, entry. Entry, that last part is a dictionary for those of you guys that don't know Python. It's essentially a hash table where entry is the name of the variable in the template, and then E is whatever you want that variable's value to be. So the template would look like this. You put the entry headline right there between the H1s, post it on, and then whatever the pub date is, and the entry body. It's a very simple template language, and yet very, very powerful, and it does not allow Python code execution. It's intended to be designer friendly, because of the way kind of our philosophy is that the designer is not necessarily a programmer. You shouldn't have to deal with Python code, and you shouldn't have to worry about security issues of dealing with raw Python code. However, you still can write custom tags that let you do other assorted logic with the pure power of Python if you want to. That's basically the stack. Models, URLs, views, which are those functions, and the templates. Any one of these pieces of the stack, as I mentioned, can be swapped out for anything else, because it's all very loosely coupled. What else do you get with this framework? The first really, really big contribution from the community after we open sourced it is internationalization, so that any app in Django can automatically know what the languages, it'll automatically handle the language support from browsers, so that if your browser is configured to use Polish, it'll send out Polish things. It provides a framework for specifying translation strings. So I don't know if anyone here deals with I-18N, but it's very, very handy. And already we have 19 translations of the Django admin, and it's really a trip to go in there and, just for the hell of it, change your browser to French or Icelandic and see the admin work in a different language. This is really, really cool. And the coolest thing about it is we have Welsh. I don't think any other open source project, that's probably an exaggeration, but we have Welsh, so I'm really excited. Another thing is the cache system, because we're really, really interested in performance. You can cache objects on a very granular, low-level way. You can cache just entire pages, or you can cache your entire site. I'm about to launch my first Django app at Washington Post, and that's going to be using the entire site-wide cache, because it's like 4 million records, and it's a high-traffic site. So the cache system is, in that case, was as easy as adding a single line that says use cache equals true. It doesn't actually say that, but essentially it does. There's authentication. The admin site that I showed you gives you free authentication, users and permissions, and you can have groups and assign permissions to groups and all that. But you can use it outside of it if you want to. You're not tied to using it. You're not tied to using the admin site if you don't want to anyway. There's anonymous session support, handy for shopping carts and all that stuff. There's an RSS Atom framework that shouldn't even be legal, because it makes you, it's like this amount of code and you have RSS feeds for everything. It's very, very cool. And there's this concept of generic views. That blog permalink thing that I showed you, that was a view, but there are certain patterns in web development that can be abstracted on an even higher level. And that was a good example. It just displayed a template rendering some object from the URL. So with Django, you can step even one step back and not even have to write any Python code at all. You just, in your URL, you point to a generic view function and you tell it, I'm using the blog object, and it'll automatically do everything for you. The only thing you have to do is write the template. We really find ourselves, when we do Django, we really find ourselves focusing on the user interface and the templates, because there is no code to write. Which sites are using this? I did a little side project, chicagocrime.org, that if any of you guys live in the city, use this and become scared. It's a freely browsable database of crimes reported in Chicago. It's updated every day. You can go to a city block level, browse by date, street, all this stuff. So it was slashed out a couple times. And as a result of the first time, that's when we wrote the cache framework. But after that, it held up very well. Here's an example of Ajax with Django, the crime map. You can specify which crimes you want to look for. It automatically updates the map. Sexy. There's this the Polish version of Friendster, grono.net, has, it was a big Java shop, and they've converted a couple of pages on their site to use Django, and they've said that it's like revolutionized things. For one, it's fun to write code again because Python kicks ass. For two, the amount of code goes from this to this. And three, the performance is better. So I don't know why you wouldn't do this. That just announced this week was a site of Greenpeace, which is doing this cool new thing using Django. So that I'm interested in finding out more about myself. So if you like this, if you like what you're hearing here, you can put one of these guys on your site. I have one on my blog because it's still running that PHP abomination. And this actually was requested from the community, believe it or not. The community is really cool. And I'm just going to close with a couple of quotes. I've played more with Django and grown to love it more with every passing day. I'm desperately looking for someone to pay me to build something with Django. And if it doesn't happen soon, I'm just going to go on strike. I've spent few hours redunking my head in the Django soup. That is one impressive open source project that shows, or at least seems to show, that people who designed it really knew what they were doing. It feels like opening up an iPod box and admiring the packaging, design, and button layout from the guy who wrote the O'Reilly Python cookbook. I'm starting to rewrite the whatever website using Django, and I'm amazed at my progress. And I'll migrate my PHP stuff to Django and such frameworks in the future. PHP's brain-dead decisions by its developers, such as at least 30 functions that begin with A, has annoyed me a bit too much by now. Time to write a to-do list web app, 16 minutes. Ever since I laid my eyes on Django, I knew one day I'd be running my website off of this web framework. And finally, conclusion, Django makes life easier. So I'd invite you to check it out. It's at djangoproject.com, and very, very cool. And that's about it. So thank you very much for listening.